All right, everybody, we're going to take a break away from destroying car engines and shit to look into the world of axle paddles, which, you know, typically are mostly for Hondas, but you can do it to just about anything with a solid rear axle if you're determined enough. Nobody's done a video talking about the difference between the drum paddle, the axle paddle, the wheel paddles. Not that I've seen anyway. Axle paddles aren't a new thing. They've been around for about, I would say, 10 to 12 years for sure. I was hoping to do a video showcasing the differences. Let's get started. So this is a 2014 Honda Foreman 500 electric shift. It's got wheel paddles. The wheel paddles are driven off the wheel hubs. They're the easiest one to do. They require the least modification, but they're not as effective as some of the other ones, and I find them more damaging to the machine. Next is your brake drum paddle. This is a 91 Honda 300. We'll get into how it can turn tires like this in a little bit, but for the start of it, this one's got a drum paddle. And the drum paddle is essentially canceling out your brake drum and replacing it with a steel paddle wheel. It requires a little bit of modification. Typically on a Honda, you cancel the brake drum because the brake drum causes more damage than good. The brakes on Hondas tend to fill with water and cause premature bearing failures. They fill the axle shaft with water, you get rust problems. They typically fill but never drain themselves. You have to drain them yourselves. So as far as that goes with Hondas, back brakes are a luxury you can't afford. On to the next one, the actual axle paddle. Now some guys will do them right in the middle and completely modify the suspension. Now that's okay if you want to do that. It depends on your level of interest in how deep you want to modify the machine. For this one, all I did was put a slightly off-center axle paddle. This one requires by far the most modification to the machine. There's no putting it back to factory without replacing a lot of components. So with this one, you're driven directly off the axle of the quad. So you've cut your tube, you've removed your brakes, and now you've got the paddle wheel driving just off center, which is the best for functional in the mud. You can almost effectively eliminate rear end drag. I prefer it, but that's just me. On to our next one. The drum paddle runs right off the splines of the axle. So you're not modifying the axle, you're not welding to the axle, you're not changing anything effectively about the functionality of the rear end. The only thing you're doing is eliminating a useless brake assembly and replacing it with a paddle wheel. The only issue becomes clearance to above components, and if you're worried about it, you can put you could weld in a limiting bar or something of that sort. This one actually hasn't had any grief, so I've just left it alone. It functions quite well, but it's not dead center, so you still bottom out on the diff itself. It's significantly better than not doing it, but it's not the most effective. On to our least effective and by far easiest one to do, the solid axle done in the wheel paddles. Essentially the wheel paddles are just plates that bolt on behind the hub. They work quite well, but your center is still entirely vulnerable to being bottomed out, and I've had this happen on several occasions. The issue with these as far as wear is you have to remove the brake assembly, which, like all the other ones, you have to remove all the brake assembly to make this function, or you could run it strictly on one side, which is not particularly effective. But the problem is that you're putting unnecessary strain on your hub ends, you're putting unnecessary wear on the actual wheel studs, and you have the possibility of your wheels coming loose due to movement between the rim and the hub. Now, I have run into this problem. Essentially, my solution was I was building a dually kit where I can mount a second wheel on it, and it works. But the problem is if the rim and the backing plate for the axle paddle or the wheel paddles decides they're going to have movement, you start hogging out the holes on the rims. And this can be an expensive process, as you can imagine, as you damage the hub, the rim, the studs, everything. Another issue I had with these Hondas is, and this might be related more to the tires than it is to the paddle, is that the paddles when you're playing in the mud, cause vibration on the drive line. And as you can see, I've replaced these 4 bolts They actually completely stripped out of the rear diff. It cost me very little. It cost me a case of beer to get it fixed. But I had to essentially drill and retap over to a bigger size. And how many more times I could get away with that, I don't know. I don't think it'll be an issue as they've been Loctited this time. But that could have been an issue from the factory, them being loose and me not catching it. So we just move on from there and make peace with my stupidity. Anyway, so as per how these things can actually turn, like a 2014 Foreman 500 can actually turn 30-inch assassinators. This thing has a 35% gear reduction and a clutch spring kit. So it is essentially 35% slower, although it's not quite that bad when you factor in the height ties between 25-inch tires and 30-inch tires. On to the 300. The 300 has a 55% gear reduction and aftermarket clutches, but it doesn't have any clutch kit of any kind. It turns with this gear reduction the wheels quite easily. I have no complaints, except that I locked up the front diff and it is difficult to steer. So you're not going to be throwing a kid on this machine. It does not steer very well. You could leave the front diff open, but as anyone knows with these older quads, especially these Hondas, they are 3-wheel drive. On to the last one. This is a 250 85 250 TRX. It has no gear reduction of any kind. It is completely factory. If you're playing in the mud, you're down to first gear. That's just the way it is. It's running 29.5 Outlaws on it. I got this quad from another guy you guys might know on YouTube, Zip Ties and Bias Plies. His name's Peg. He's a hell of a guy. You should check him out if you get a chance. Anyway, hopefully this is somewhat useful. If it's not, feel free to call me an idiot. I'm fine with that. If you're curious about doing axle paddles, you can always message me as well. It's a blast. They're great. I am constantly dragging my brother's Outlander 1000 out of holes. I haven't had any major mechanical failures, except that I did slip the clutches on the 500 and thus installed a clutch kit to repair this problem. I will see you guys soon again. I am making a video on the long-going history of ATV tires from 1980 to today. Thanks. Bye.